Welcome to Metrics That Matter. We will learn how to make sense of your fundraising data to make better decisions and raise more money with less effort. Brought to you by fundraisingreportcard.com, a simple and free analytics and reporting tool for nonprofit pros. Now measuring is easier than ever with fundraisingreportcard.com. I'm Tim Chaten, host of the show. On the premiere episode of Metrics That Matter, Zach Shefska and I will be diving into the first part of the Metrics That Matter ebook, found for free at fundraisingreportcard.com/book. I encourage you to download your copy to follow along and maybe find some tidbits we didn't have time to cover on today's episode. With that, let's get to the first episode of Metrics That Matter. Welcome to Metrics That Matter. How's it going, Zach?
Wow. I have my own podcast.
You do, yeah.
I'm doing well, Tim. Excited to be doing this.
So, first off, what is this podcast? What is Metrics That Matter, and why should people want to listen to this and care?
Yeah, so if you're a development professional, if you're a board member, if you're in the nonprofit world, consultant even, or even like a direct mail agency, if you work for one of them, you probably have heard people talking about data. And when you talk about data and information, you ultimately end up talking about, well, how do we make it useful? Part of the goal here with Metrics That Matter is to be able to take all that data and all that information that we're collecting and actually make it usable, actionable. So we'll be talking about the different fundraising performance metrics that you should be measuring, how you actually calculate them, different resources you have at your disposal, and then most importantly, not to leave you high and dry, what are the next steps? How do I apply these at my shop? How do I apply these with my clients? Things like that.
Okay, wonderful. And for most nonprofits, where are the most people at? Are they gathering stuff without knowing what to do with it? What's the state of the union, I guess, for fundraisers?
Yeah. So having done this a few years now and working with, I think it's like 2,300 plus organizations at this point, I've seen a wide variety of where organizations are. Now, a lot of that depends on size of organization. So if you're listening to this and you're a small shop, if you're one or two people, if you've got, maybe annual revenues, donation revenues of like $1 million or less, some of these concepts are things you may have heard before, but they've been a little bit too outside of your reach. If you're listening to this and you're the VP of analytics at a higher education institution and you've got an entire, analytics team, some of these concepts might be refreshing in the sense that you've heard about them in the past, but now you've moved on to predictive modeling and prescriptive analytics and things like that. This will kind of bring you back to square one, descriptive analytics, the first step towards using data to help you with your decision making. So from my experience, it depends on size and genuinely it depends on like budget and resources. The hope we have here with Metrics That Matter is that regardless of where you are on that spectrum, you're going to be able to take away some next steps, something usable from the conversations that we have here.
Okay, and something I should say, it would be good to download the Data-Driven Fundraisers Reference Guide as a companion to this podcast. A lot of the things we'll talk about in this podcast will be in that as well. So there will be a link in the show notes and in the chapter if you're listening, and one of those things that support that. But anyways, one thing I want to bring up is decision-making processes. What does it look like to make decisions based off of data versus, I guess, emotional decisions? Is that the alternative? What's the alternative?
Sure, yeah. So there's a big discussion within our sector, the art versus science of fundraising, right? Is it more art? Is it more science? Is it somewhere in between? And that goes back to decision making. If you think about how you make decisions anecdotally or historically at your organization, it could potentially be some sort of gut feeling. Someone holds most of the sway. They suggest we do something. Okay, we do it. Could be some sort of tribal council, where we bring people together and we say, okay, what are we going to do? And everyone shares their opinion. Or it could be the opposite end of the spectrum, more of the science side, where you have someone internally at your organization who says, no, you must A/B split test everything. And if one thing has a 2% higher response rate, we do that from now on. And that's very rigid, and I've experienced organizations that have folks just like that. But to bring the conversation back to decision making, there's this concept called evidence-based practices. And evidence-based practices have their roots, at least in the research that I've done on it, in healthcare and public health, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole concept, it's very, very straightforward. It's have a hypothesis, have something that you're going to question, test that something, and then measure the results. Evidence-based. Right?
Yeah.
And the hope is that in our sector, we're able to adapt some of those evidence-based practices, such as, could be on the art side of the equation where it's does schmoozing with a major gift prospect while giving them a tour of the basketball locker room increase their likelihood to buy season tickets.
Mm-hmm.
You can test that. You have your hypotheses. Does that outcome, is that a result?
Yeah.
You can test that. But it's applying that kind of structure, just like the data analytics person, the hardliner on the science side who wants to do that with everything, A/B split test, everything.
Yeah.
It's meeting in the middle, and it's having some accountability for what are the outcomes of what we're doing.
Is there a fear or worry to be had of we've always done it this way and we're good with these results, and having expectations be status quo versus not knowing your true potential and trying something different?
Sure. I mean, candidly, we even experienced that at our for-profit company,
Mm-hmm.
right, where you can fall into kind of this period of complacency. But generally what I've experienced is once you have exposure kind of under the hood, once you've seen what some of these key metrics look like, and think about our company, Tim, right? Once you start looking at what's the average deal size, how well are we retaining our clients, then you start to aspire to boost those numbers, right? So the first step for a lot of the organizations that I get a chance to partner with is what's the baseline? Where are we? Is the board aware of where we are? Is your leadership aware of where we are? Are your fundraisers aware of where we are? And generally the answer to that is no. And that's not the fault of nonprofit staff, not in the slightest. They generally don't have the right resources. If you had to use Excel to create pivot tables to get a sense for where you are, and it took 3 weeks time and you had to get an administrative assistant on it, if you have an administrative assistant, that's a no-go. I totally get why you would skip doing that. I would skip doing that. But now that we have resources like Fundraising Report Card, there's other firms out there that try and provide similar things. Now that you can get access to those baseline metrics, it gives you the impetus to not get complacent, to aspire to achieve more, and then having that resource to measure if you actually are getting closer every 6 months, every 3 months. Even if you want to do it once a year, you now have a way to kind of hold your organization accountable and make sure you're achieving your strategic initiatives.
Okay. And what's it look like to have a culture shift from one decision-making process to being data-driven and caring about metrics? What's that culture shift look like? Because culture can take a while. There's people that are stuck in their ways and can take a bit.
So this goes above my pay grade very quickly, but Steve McLaughlin, who I might get his title wrong, but I think he's vice president of analytics, maybe.
Okay.
Steve, if you listen to this, at Blackbaud, he wrote a book, Data-Driven Nonprofits, and he talks in depth about a data-driven culture, a culture that an organization aspires to have data health and data cleanliness and data wellness, and then measures these metrics and things like that. So candidly, I've been in my position working with organizations 2.5, 3 years now. I honestly think that a full culture shift takes longer than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It could take 5 years, could take 7 years. It's not something that you snap your fingers and now every decision is being made, backed by data. So it's interesting from my perspective, being able to go in and out of organizations and see some that are more data-driven initially and then taking the next step and leveraging resources like Fundraising Report Card, et cetera. And you can really see they've made it. They're there, they're happy. Yeah. To ones that are entirely at the other side where everything's been done gut feel, and that's our retention rate. For an organization like that to get to where another one is, they have to want that, and then it's going to take years. It's going to take different people in different positions, someone in a leadership role who also supports that. And Steve's book, Data-Driven Nonprofits, goes in more depth on this.
Okay. And are there any other preliminary things we should bring up before diving into what metrics actually matter and which ones we should start looking at?
Yeah. Data health, data wellness. The quality of the information that you have will dictate how significant the outcomes are of the metrics that we're looking at and how much application they can have in your strategy and tactics and things like that.
And this is how you're capturing the data?
So there's a few pieces, Tim, and it's what I've learned over the years is it's how you're capturing the data, yes. It's where you're storing the data. Do you have disparate systems, which, surprisingly enough, a lot of organizations do. They use one system for peer-to-peer giving. They use another system for their primary database. They use another system for alumni giving. So you have to be cognizant of that. You need to then also think about, well, have we had staff turnover or different practices in place in how we enter this information into the different databases? And that's unfortunately an area where I see a lot of consternation in the present, is that, we've had 3 people in that role over the past 5 years, and I think they all entered appeal codes as different custom fields in the main database. Well, if we want to run an analysis of which appeal had higher retention rate, better lifetime value, things like that, it makes it tricky.
Yeah.
So the quality of how we're storing information isn't fun. It's not cool to think about. It's really kind of boring. But following whatever practices and procedures your organization has in place, or if you're in a position where you can implement those practices and procedures, do it, because it's incredibly powerful. The more concrete, accurate data and information that we have, the more meaningful the analysis we can provide. So when we're looking at these metrics, when we're looking at data visualization that compels the board and things like that, to know and have confidence in what we're looking at, it'll further the conversation. It'll be incredibly powerful. Data, health, wellness, cleanliness, whatever you want to call it, is a huge, huge barrier to entry.
In quantity as well.
Quantity is going to play a role as well.
Okay.
I would say it's not as important as, quality versus quantity.
Right, yeah.
We need good information, not necessarily a ton of information. If you have a ton of information, awesome, because we'll really be able to distill it down to something that we're able to look at and understand what's happening, from hundreds of thousands or millions of pieces of data to one visualization that compels us to take action. That's compelling in that sense. But the quality of that information trumps it in terms of precedence.
I just want to take a minute to remind you to download the Metrics That Matter book by visiting www.fundraisingroreportcard.com/book. This book will help you learn what data-driven fundraising is and identify key metrics to measure. You'll learn how to calculate your retention rates and identify ways you can benchmark performance against your peers, and much more. Once again, go to fundraisingroreportcard.com/book to download your copy. So the 3 starting points in looking at our data, the first one in the guide here is annual rate of growth.
Sure.
What, I'm not on the metrics. What is this?
So this is simply looking at year over year. How quickly are we growing or shrinking?
Okay.
So in terms of dollars raised. So at your organization, how many dollars were raised last year? Mm-hmm. And how many dollars were raised this year or 2 years ago versus this year, so on and so forth. It's that percentage change.
And do you take into account how many donors grew or lost into this rate of growth?
So rate of growth is simply that aggregate or top line number. You can get into some more specifics. What was our rate of downgrading donors? What was our rate of upgrading donors? Attrition, things like that. But simply to kind of lay down a baseline. Are we growing? Great. How much? Are we shrinking? Nah, not so much fun. How much? Both in terms of dollars, aka donations, and in terms of donors. And where you can get a little bit more granular here is once you feel comfortable with that concept, which is relatively straightforward, you can break that then down by giving level. So are we growing? What's our growth rate in terms of annual fund donors? And I see this with a ton of organizations that invest heavily in annual fund, direct mail appeals, things like that. You'll have great donor growth and donation growth rates in terms of maybe the under $100 segment of your donors.
Yeah.
Then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you start to look at, well, what's our donor growth rate in terms of $1,000 and above donors? And an organization has had to allocate budget towards the smaller dollar donors, and you actually see a decrease in the growth rate. It could be negative. You could have gone from 50, 1,000 and above donors last year to only, 45 this year. That's going to have a negative growth rate. And you'll be able to start to quantify, which way are we trending broken down by segment of donor.
And do we want to trend that way too?
Exactly.
Do we want to focus on the $1,000 plus donors, which you probably do?
Well,
or maybe not.
It's different for every organization. That comes back to strategy.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of looking at these metrics is that they should spark a conversation for strategy. That's literally what data is meant to do, and especially data visualization. It's meant to spark a conversation because the numbers and the algorithms that you're going to run it through, the calculations to get to growth rate or more sophisticated metrics that we'll touch on throughout this series.
Yeah.
those algorithms and calculations, they don't know the nuance of your organization or what appeals went out at which month or which events have been going on and things like that. You and your staff do. You and your team do. So it's your responsibility to take the information that the calculations are giving you and say, okay, why is this the case? Why has it trended this way? That conversation should then spark, well, do we want to continue trending in this way? And if we do, great. Let's keep allocating resources the way we are. Let's test some different things, evidence-based practices. But it all comes back to looking at that metric. Is it doing what we want it to do? If not, let's start asking why.
Yeah, a Terminator does not think like computers don't think. It just does.
Yep.
And you, the human, needs to either take that in consideration and do the thinking.
As more and more automation happens, you know how you read in the news, it's like these jobs are being taken over by robots.
Self-driving cars and all that. Yeah.
If you're listening to this, you don't have to worry.
Yeah, you got a brain, you need to think. Yeah.
Yeah, we need you.
So the next up is the average annual gift size. And we talked a little bit about this with concentrating on the 1,000+ donors and things like that. Can you go into this and why it's important?
So average gift size, average donation amount, it's important. It's also not that important. It's a good kind of starting place for an organization that doesn't have a baseline of which metrics to measure. You could also look at mode gift amount, median gift amount, and then, of course, mean here with average. What's interesting about average is when you look at it broken down by giving level. Because if you were to look at your entire donor database from the past 5 years, and let's say a huge bequest came in 3 years ago, your average donation amount is probably going to be skewed 3 years ago from the, let's call it $1 million bequest that came in. And of course, you could run this calculation for average donation amount without, that bequest in there. But still, it's got the potential to really be skewed very quickly. So when you break down average donation amount by giving level, so for example, let's use our under $100 example again, or if you're a heavy direct mail organization, maybe even look at your average donation amount of under $20 donors. What is the mean amount that's coming in? Maybe it could be $10 or $15. That won't be skewed by a major donor making a major contribution, while also when you're looking at maybe a $10,000 and above average donation amount, you're able to get some clarity on what is the average donation from a major donor. So average donation amount, you have to be wary. You have to look at it by giving level, and you should also consider some of the other pieces in there, median and mode as well.
Okay. Back to middle school math that was.
Hey, man, that stuff's tricky.
Yeah.
My mom was a middle school math teacher, and I remember sometimes like the pre-algebra stuff.
Yeah.
Sine. I think sine's a thing.
Yeah.
Cosine.
Yeah.
It's another thing.
Math I love, but struggled so much. My favorite class, but I hated it.
No. It's pretty simple stuff. And especially when we're on this podcast, especially, we're going to focus on, and this is a keyword if you want to Google it, descriptive analytics. It's the first, we're using historical data, just trying to understand what happened in the past. We're not prescribing things, we're not predicting things or anything like that. Mean, median, mode, yes, it goes back to middle school math, but we're not doing anything too intimidating, especially as we continue through these episodes. This is all in your wheelhouse. I know you're a development professional. I know you're a board member. I know you're a consultant. Don't be intimidated. You have resources that are going to help you do the actual number crunching. Not going to keep name dropping.
You don't need to be a mathematician.
Yeah. Exactly. The brain thing, right? I need you to interpret what it means.
Yeah.
The reason that I and the team here at MarketSmart built fundraising report card is literally so that you don't have to sit in Excel. Just what does it mean? How do we interpret it? What are the next steps? So
So you said we wouldn't predict things, but this next one has a little bit of prediction, I think. The lifetime value of a donor. Can you go into what that is and how you come up with this value?
So instead of prediction, it's called a projection. Essentially what lifetime value is it's this projection of how much revenues you can associate with a relationship with a donor. Now, this is not telling you if you've got a donor in your database, John Doe, and you look at John Doe and you see his cumulative giving from his entire lifetime with the organization, let's call it 10 years, is $750. Sure, that is John Doe's lifetime value. That is not what we're talking about here.
Right.
We are not assigning a specific dollar amount to each donor in your database. I can't do that. I don't know how that would possibly work. I can't, looking at the data doesn't allow me to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at your database, let's say you've got 10,000 donations that have come in over the past 10 years. We're able to start to figure out some key input metrics that allow us to create this projection. For example, we were just talking about one, average donation amount. Let's think about this entire conversation in terms of lifetime value for under $100 donors. So we have our average donation amount of an under $100 donor in calendar year 2017. That's one input metric. The next input metric that we're going to look for is donor lifespan. How long are donors in the under $100 segment retaining and maintaining a relationship with the organization? Is it that they're giving once and then leaving? Is it that they're giving once and then leaving and then coming back? What count? What is the lifespan of that relationship?
I'd imagine recurring donations that some donors just forget they have going on would be a huge part of that equation too, right?
I have a hunch we'll be talking about monthly giving at some point on this podcast, Tim.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so our two inputs so far, average donation amount broken down by giving level, and we're going to talk about under 100. Donor lifespan, how long are those donors giving to the organization in the under $100 segment, and then frequency of giving.
Yeah.
How often, just like you were talking about, monthly, for example, are donors in the under $100 segment giving 5 gifts per year? Great. Yeah. We take those 3 input metrics, multiply them together, again, broken down by every segment, and that becomes this projection of what is the lifetime value of my relationship with a donor in this particular segment. So it's not saying John Doe's lifetime value is this. Yeah. It's simply saying if you were to acquire a new donor in one of these particular segments, giving level segments, this is what that relationship has the potential to be worth if you steward it like you've been stewarding it, things like that.
And I love the Starbucks example in the book.
Yeah.
That Starbucks can spend, $2,000 on a person? More than that, right?
It was more.
Yeah, I mean,
somewhere in the book, I think it's like $2,500 or something like that, and then they end up making in revenue like $15,000. It's absolutely ridiculous, and it all comes back to it's this concept of acquisition cost. How much can we afford to spend versus lifetime value? And there's a whole section in the book. I think it's chapter 4 or 5.
Yeah. So later on we'll dive more into that, but you could look at that and say, oh, we should not spend that money on that segment because it's a negative ROI versus that seems like a lot of money to spend on that part of our donor base, but if you look at the ROI, not so much.
Especially as you start to break down these metrics. And we're going to start relatively simple, but if you break down these metrics that matter for a particular campaign type or an appeal that you've been running year over year over year, you're able to start to justify allocating more resources towards a particular appeal. If the lifetime value of appeal A has been consistently greater than the lifetime value of appeal B, 2 different appeals you send out year over year, great. Let's invest more in appeal A. Let's get the most out of it. That's the direction that we'll take the conversation.
Okay.
And that's ideally where all organizations should be when they're comparing donor acquisition cost to donor lifetime value, broken down by giving level, broken down by acquisition channel. It's tough to get there.
Yeah,
and you need staff and you need things like that. But man, when you are there,
it's powerful. Yeah. So key takeaways from all this information, they're listening and then they want to go apply this at their shop. What's the next step for fundraisers out there?
So the most important thing when you're hearing about these metrics is not to immediately think, okay, where am I? How do I compare to my peers? I need to go calculate these. I need to see how I'm doing compared to the organization right next door. Don't worry about that. What you need to do is kind of get a historical perspective. Compare your organization to yourself. So I've mentioned it a couple times. Fundraising report card. There's a free version of the tool out there. It'll calculate some of these metrics for you. I would start there. Look at yourself, your organization, a 5-year snapshot, a 10-year snapshot if you have that much data. And let's see how we've been trending in terms of some of these key metrics. Has our growth rate been going up? Has it been going down? Has our average donation amount been going up? Has it been going down? Get some baseline. That would be if after you hear this and you go to your next meeting and you go on a donor visit and it's next thing you know it's 7 p.m. and you still haven't gone home, but you're like, okay, I want to do one more thing. Please don't go home.
Go home. Yes.
But if you are, just upload your data. Let's take a peek at what some of these metrics are. Let's lay down the foundation so that then we can look at, and we'll talk about this at some point, I'm sure, on the podcast, benchmarking. How do I compare to other organizations my size or my sector? What are some of the best practices or potential strategies I can implement? And then we'll get on at some point, Tim, I'm sure, about kind of the full cycle here, which is getting a foundation for where you are, discussing that with your colleagues and staff, identifying the strategies that you want to put into place, making sure that you have the tactics to facilitate that strategy, executing those tactics, 6 months later, 12 months later, reanalyzing your meaningful metrics to make sure that it worked. That's the loop we want here. But step 1 on that long process that is going to take you 12, 18 months to implement, let's just get a baseline upload some data, get the key metrics, make sure, if you don't want to upload your data to fundraising report card, totally get it. If you don't want to use the pro version, that's A-okay. Just have some sort of standardized way to get this information. Reference the book. It has the equations. You need this to be standardized, because the last thing you want is to set some baseline metrics today, go through all the steps that we'll discuss over weeks and weeks and weeks on this podcast, implement those strategies, and then you have someone new on staff who calculates retention rate a little bit differently than you do.
Yeah.
That's not going to look so hot when it goes lower, even though it was standardization. That's why I say fundraising report card, because it's the same every time. But if you don't feel comfortable, just make sure in the back of your mind it's standardized.
And as an individual, can you do this, or do you need to bring together a couple different people? Your nonprofit probably depends.
It's going to depend on the size of your organization and also kind of like the resources that you have. You know this as well as I, Tim, because we work with these folks all day. You're probably understaffed. You're probably under-resourced. You're probably coming close to over budget, so you can't purchase many things.
Right.
This might be a project where you have to kind of scrap together your time. Look to us as a vendor. That's what we are. Look to us to help if we can, if you've got budget, if you've got space. You might need some other people internally, but from my experience, you're probably going to be hard-pressed to get their time.
Yeah, you might get pushback, and this might not be something that gets really...
It's hard to get buy-in. It's easier to get buy-in once you have something to show. So once we have this foundation of metrics, that's when you can start to have the discussion. We'll probably talk as well, Tim, about data visualization. If you've ever seen an Excel pivot table and then you're looking at it, you're like, what is this supposed to show me? Imagine you go up cold to one of your colleagues that you want to get involved, who you think may have some interest, and you show them a data table, they're not going to be that interested. But if we can take these metrics, put them into a chart, a data visualization, then we're getting a little bit closer to maybe getting them on our team. We'll talk about some tactics. I think I've written some blog posts in the past about how to compel other folks to look at data and be interested in the data, of course, those metrics. But like I said, foundation, let's get a baseline. Peek under your own hood, call it like a mechanic.
Yeah, a little checkup.
Exactly. Where are we? We got to know where we are first, and then we can start taking these next steps to build the strategy, the tactics, the feedback loop to measure if it's working, and ultimately that data-driven culture that we're striving for.
Sounds good.
Sounds great. Damn.
Right. Well, exactly. It's been wonderful.
Thanks so much, Tim.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Metrics That Matter. If you like the show, make sure to review it on Apple Podcasts and pass along to a colleague. If you want to take the first step we talked about in this episode, head on over to fundraisingreportcard.com to start analyzing your data and generating reports for free. Once again, that's fundraisingreportcard.com. Thanks for listening to Metrics That Matter.